It is the winter of 1943, and somewhere in the shadow of an occupied French railway yard, a man in a worn workman's coat moves slowly between the coal piles. He is not a miner. He is not a laborer. He is an agent of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, and tucked beneath his arm, wrapped in oilcloth, are several lumps of coal that are not coal at all. He places them carefully, deliberately, into the pile nearest the locomotive tender. He does not rush. He does not look up. And when he walks away into the freezing dark, he leaves behind a weapon so simple, so quiet, and so utterly devastating that Nazi Germany's entire Western supply network would spend the next 2 years hunting for an enemy it could never see. The device was called the coal bomb. Or, depending on which declassified file you happen to read, the Aunt Jemima coal disguise, the Black Joe, or simply the incendiary coal. The names changed. The concept never did. A hollow casting of high explosive material, shaped and painted and textured with extraordinary precision to look exactly like an ordinary lump of bituminous coal. Drop it into a coal pile. Wait. When a German fireman shoveled it into a locomotive furnace, the results were catastrophic not just for the train, but for everything on it, everything near it, and often for the tracks themselves. What makes this story remarkable is not just the audacity of the idea, but the scale at which it was deployed. This was not a one-off trick pulled by a clever engineer in a back room. This was an industrialist deception, a mass-produced, systematically distributed sabotage program that targeted the literal engine of Nazi logistics at its most vulnerable point. The German war machine ran on supply lines. Supply lines ran on railways. Railways ran on coal. And for a brief, brilliant period of the Second World War, some of that coal was American, fake, and waiting to explode. To understand why the coal bomb existed, you have to understand the position the Allies found themselves in during the middle years of the war. By 1942, strategic bombing campaigns were underway, and they were costly. American and British bomber crews were dying in enormous numbers over Germany and occupied Europe, often targeting infrastructure that repaired itself faster than it could be destroyed. Bridges were rebuilt. Rail lines were patched. Factories were dispersed underground. The blunt instrument of aerial bombardment was working, but it was slow, expensive in lives, and imprecise in ways that frustrated Allied planners enormously. What was needed was something subtler. Something that could reach inside the enemy's infrastructure not from 30,000 feet up, but from ground level, from inside the very machinery the Germans depended upon. The OSS, established by President Franklin Roosevelt in 1942 under the direction of Major General William J. Donovan, was America's first true foreign intelligence and covert operations service. Donovan had assembled a remarkable collection of engineers, chemists, academics, psychologists, and criminals, men and women who thought about problems in ways that conventional military minds simply did not. The railways of occupied Europe presented a specific, almost perfect target. Germany's war effort was extraordinarily dependent on its rail network. By some estimates, German railways were moving more than 2 million tons of cargo every single week by the mid-war period. Ammunition, fuel, tank components, replacement aircraft engines, food, troops, everything moved by rail. And every locomotive on those lines needed coal. Enormous quantities of it. The tenders that sat directly behind each locomotive cab held anywhere from 8 to 15 metric tons of coal per journey, fed continuously into fireboxes burning at temperatures exceeding 1100 degrees Celsius. The Germans knew their railways were targets. They guarded bridges, patrolled viaducts, and stationed soldiers at key junctions. What they could not easily guard was every coal yard, every depot pile, every transfer station across thousands of kilometers of occupied territory. A lump of coal, sitting in a pile of 1,000 lumps of coal, is invisible. That invisibility was the weapon. The development of the coal bomb is credited primarily to the Research and Development Branch of the OSS, based in Washington, D.C., though much of the physical manufacturing work was carried out in facilities across the northeastern United States. The project drew on expertise from the demolitions community, the plastics industry, and rather unexpectedly, from commercial foundry work. The core challenge was not the explosive itself, that was relatively straightforward. The challenge was the disguise. Real bituminous coal is not a uniform substance. It has a complex surface texture, jagged edges, dull black faces, occasional metallic glints where carbon crystallization has occurred. It varies in size, in weight, in shape. No two lumps are identical. Replicating this convincingly enough to fool a German fireman who handled coal every day of his working life required a level of craftsmanship that bordered on artistry. The OSS solution was a two-part process. First, actual pieces of coal from European sources or coal closely matching European grades were used as molds. Real lumps were pressed into casting material to create negative forms that captured every surface irregularity, every crack, every contour. These molds were then used to cast the device itself from a mixture of plastic explosive and binder materials. The explosive compound used in most documented variants was a British-developed material called piétol, though American RDX-based compounds were used in later production runs. The final cast was coated in a layer of powdered graphite or coal dust, suspended in a binding medium, applied in multiple thin layers to match the dull, non-reflective surface appearance of real coal. The finished device weighed roughly the same as a natural lump of equivalent size, typically between 0.5 and 1.5 kilograms. It had the same visual texture. It had the same density when handled. And it was, by every account of OSS operatives trained to examine them, essentially indistinguishable from real coal under anything except the most rigorous laboratory inspection. When the device entered a locomotive firebox, the coal dust and graphite coating burned away in seconds. The plastic explosive beneath, now exposed to temperatures that real coal handles without incident, detonated. The explosion inside an enclosed locomotive firebox was not simply destructive, it was catastrophic. The firebox itself, typically constructed from boilerplate steel around 12 to 18 millimeters thick, would rupture. The boiler, operating at working pressures of up to 15 bar, would fail catastrophically. The resulting explosion was, in effect, a boiler burst, one of the most violent mechanical failures a railway locomotive can experience. The locomotive was destroyed. The crew was killed. The train stopped. The line was blocked. Production of the coal bomb took place in several locations, with some assembly work reportedly carried out in workshops in Baltimore and New Jersey. Exact production numbers remain classified in certain file categories, but declassified OSS records suggest that thousands of devices were manufactured during the peak production period between early 1943 and late 1944. Distribution of the coal bombs to the field was carried out through OSS networks operating inside occupied France, Belgium, and to a lesser extent, inside Germany itself. Agents were given devices in small quantities, often no more than 5 or 10 at a time, which they were instructed to place in coal supplies serving specific high-priority locomotives. Priority targets included trains moving German armored equipment, ammunition, and petroleum products. The operational procedure was elegantly simple. An agent with legitimate access to a railway yard, perhaps posing as a maintenance worker, a contractor, or a black market coal supplier, would approach a coal pile and slip the devices in among the real coal. No timer. No trigger. No mechanism to fail. The enemy's own firemen would do the rest. Documented instances of coal bomb success are difficult to compile because the program's secrecy meant that after-action reports were fragmentary, and Allied intelligence specifically avoided claiming credit for destroyed locomotives to protect the cover of the program. What is known from declassified OSS records is that the coal bomb program was considered sufficiently effective that it continued in active production and deployment throughout 1944. German records from the period document a significant increase in unexplained locomotive failures and boiler accidents in the Western Rail network, failures that German railway engineers were unable to attribute to mechanical wear or maintenance failures, because the evidence was invariably destroyed in the explosion itself. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The coal bomb was not an exclusively American idea, it is important to be precise about that. British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, had developed a broadly similar concept that they referred to variously as the explosive coal or the clam mine variant, and there is documented evidence that British and American intelligence shared technical information on the concept as early as 1942. What distinguished the American OSS version was primarily the scale of industrial production and the sophistication of the casting process. The British SOE version, while effective, was produced in smaller quantities and relied on slightly different explosive compounds and coating methods. OSS technical reports from 1943 noted that the American casting process produced a more convincing surface finish, partly because of access to higher quality industrial molding equipment, and partly because of the involvement of commercial foundry expertise that the SOE's more improvised manufacturing process could not match. German attempts to replicate or counter the coal bomb program are instructive. By late 1943, German railway security had begun implementing coal inspection protocols at certain high-priority depots, physical examination of coal supplies before loading, the use of metal detection equipment at some locations, and the introduction of civilian informant networks tasked with reporting suspicious behavior around railway fuel storage. These countermeasures were partially effective. They also consumed significant German security resources, forced the diversion of manpower to railway protection duties, and created delays in locomotive servicing that had cascading effects on operational timetables. The Japanese, it is worth noting, were never subjected to a coal bomb campaign of equivalent scale. The geography of the Pacific War made railway sabotage a far less dominant strategic concern than maritime interdiction. But the coal bomb concept found its way into post-war sabotage manuals that influenced intelligence agency thinking for decades afterward. Assessing the true impact of the coal bomb program is genuinely difficult, and anyone who gives you precise figures is almost certainly extrapolating beyond the evidence. What can be said with reasonable confidence is this: the program destroyed a documented number of locomotives, disrupted railway schedules across occupied France and Belgium during a period when German logistical reliability was already under significant strain from aerial bombardment, and perhaps most importantly, forced the Germans to allocate defensive resources to a threat they struggled to understand or quantify. The psychological dimension should not be understated. A locomotive crew riding a machine they know might explode without warning from fuel they cannot fully trust is a crew operating under a form of psychological pressure that no amount of discipline or training entirely removes. German railway workers' testimonies from the post-war period include references to a pervasive anxiety about unexplained boiler failures during the mid-war years, an anxiety that the German Railway Administration never fully managed to address, partly because they could not definitively explain the cause. The coal bomb's legacy in the world of covert operations is significant. It represents one of the earliest examples of what modern analysts would call a supply chain attack, a method of warfare that targets not the enemy's military directly, but the systems that sustain and supply it. The concept of introducing a seemingly inert, harmless object into an adversary's logistics chain, an object that activates only when the enemy's own personnel interact with it in a normal operational way, is one that intelligence agencies have returned to repeatedly in the decades since the Second World War. No coal bombs are publicly displayed in any major museum collection, which is perhaps appropriate for a weapon designed above all else never to be noticed. Some OSS artifacts are held at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and the International Spy Museum in Washington has documented several OSS devices from the period. The coal bomb, by its nature, tended not to survive its own use. Return, for a moment, to that railway yard in occupied France in the winter of 1943. The agent is gone. The coal pile sits undisturbed in the cold. Somewhere in that pile, among 1,000 identical black shapes, several lumps of coal are not coal. They are patience. They are precision. They are the particular genius of a war in which the most devastating weapons were not always the largest, or the loudest, or the most expensive. The locomotive comes in the early morning, exhaling white steam in the freezing air. The fireman climbs down from the cab, picks up his shovel, and begins loading the tender. He is tired. He has done this 1,000 times. He does not look closely at the coal. There is no reason to look closely at coal. Somewhere between the yard and the next station, the firebox temperature reaches the point of no return. The device detonates. The boiler fails. The train stops. And in a war defined by the movement of men and machines, a stopped train is something between an inconvenience and a catastrophe, depending on what it was carrying and where it needed to be. The Germans wrote it up as a boiler failure. Another unexplained mechanical incident on the Western network. They had been seeing more of these lately. Their engineers could find no satisfactory explanation. Their maintenance records showed nothing unusual. The coal had arrived from a certified supplier. The locomotive had been recently serviced. Meanwhile, in a nondescript office building in Washington, D.C., an OSS report was quietly filed. Another successful deployment. No agents compromised. No evidence recovered. The program continued. The coal bomb was never a war-winning weapon. No single device ever is. What it was, at its best, was a weapon that made the enemy afraid of something it could not see, could not inspect, could not guard against without enormous cost, and could never fully understand. It made the mundane dangerous. It made the routine lethal. It made a fireman hesitate before picking up his shovel, and in a war fought over timetables and tonnage and the movement of armies across a continent, hesitation has consequences. Somewhere in the coal pile, the weapon waits. The fireman shovels. The firebox burns. And the train never arrives.